I've always loved libraries. The quiet hum of words resting on pages, the scent of old paper, the feeling that you're never truly alone because 1,000 voices are waiting, bound in leather and ink. After graduating college, I took a job as a library assistant at the Waverley County Library, a crumbling relic from the 19th century, with high-arched windows and endless labyrinths of dusty shelves. It seemed like the perfect job to settle into while I figured out my next steps. Or so I thought. It's funny how comforting the silence of a library can seem, until it becomes oppressive, like a living, breathing thing that watches you when you aren't paying attention. My first day started innocently enough. The head librarian, Mrs. Gilchrist, was waiting for me at the front desk when I walked in. She was a stern, pinched woman in her late 60s, with tight grey curls and glasses that perched on the tip of her nose like they might slide off at any moment. She rarely smiled, and when she did, it was more like a twitch of her lips, as though she didn't remember how. "Welcome, Miss Andrews," she said in a voice as dry as the brittle pages of a forgotten book. "We have high expectations for our assistants here. This library is special. You'll come to understand that in time." I nodded politely, unsure of what she meant. Special? Sure, the building was ancient and some of the books were rare, but it was still just a library. At least, that's what I told myself. Mrs. Gilchrist led me through the maze of shelves, past reading alcoves and the reference section, and finally to a small office tucked away in the back. The office smelled of musty paper and something else, something faintly metallic that I couldn't quite place. "You'll be working the evening shifts," she said, her voice low. "It's quiet at night, and you'll have plenty of time to shelve books, organize the archives, and assist the few patrons who come in. We close at 9, but I'll expect you to lock up by 10 after the janitor finishes his work." I raised an eyebrow. "The janitor?" "Mr. Wren," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "He's been here longer than I have, but he keeps to himself. Don't mind him. Just focus on your duties, Miss Andrews. We'll speak more tomorrow." With that, she left me in the dim office, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor as she disappeared into the shadowy aisles. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and began familiarizing myself with the stacks. The first few days passed without incident, though I did begin to notice things that unsettled me. At night, the library took on a life of its own. The rows of shelves seemed to stretch farther than they had during the day, the shadows between them deepening into inky pools. There were sounds too, soft rustles like the pages of a book being turned, and faint whispers that I could never quite make out. One evening, as I was shelving books in the farthest corner of the library, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps behind me. Startled, I spun around, expecting to see Mrs. Gilchrist or a late patron, but the aisle was empty. The silence that followed was thick, heavy. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, and turned back to the shelves, only to find a book lying on the floor that hadn't been there before. It was an old, leather-bound tome, its spine cracked and weathered. The title was faded, but I could just make out the words in gold letters. I had never seen it before. There was no barcode or library stamp, nothing to indicate it belonged here. As I knelt to pick it up, a cold draft washed over me, sending a shiver down my spine. The air felt wrong, heavy with something I couldn't name. Miss Andrews. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was Mrs. Gilchrist. Her eyes narrowed as she appeared at the end of the aisle. I hadn't heard her approach. "I thought I told you to stay near the front desk," she said, her voice icy. There are areas of this library you have no business being in. I'm sorry, I stammered, clutching the mysterious book to my chest. I was just... She cut me off with a sharp gesture. Put that down, now. I hesitated, the weight of the book suddenly unbearable in my hands. Mrs. Gilchrist's expression darkened, her eyes boring into mine with a cold intensity that made my skin crawl. Reluctantly, I set the book back on the shelf, and as soon as I did, the oppressive feeling in the air lifted, just slightly. Mrs. Gilchrist's lips twitched into that half-smile again, and without another word, she turned and left. As the days wore on, I began to dread my evening shifts. The strange noises persisted, the whispers growing louder and more insistent the deeper I ventured into the library's bowels. I tried to tell myself it was just the creaks and groans of an old building settling at night, but deep down I knew something was wrong. Then there was the janitor, Mr. Wren. I didn't see him often, but when I did, he made my skin crawl. He was tall and gaunt, with a mop of greasy hair and a permanent sneer that twisted his features into something grotesque. His eyes were dark and too wide, as though he were always watching, waiting. He never spoke, just shuffled about with his mop and broom. But I often caught him staring at me from across the library, his gaze lingering far too long. One night, while locking up, I saw him standing at the entrance to the basement stairs, a place Mrs. Gilchrist had specifically told me was off-limits. He didn't say anything, just watched me with that unnerving stare. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond, just continued to watch me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and disappeared down the stairs, leaving me alone in the eerie silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in the library. There was an underlying tension in the air, as though the building itself was waiting, watching. And then there were the books, those strange, leather-bound volumes that seemed to appear out of nowhere. They didn't belong in any catalogue, and yet every few days, I would find another one lying on a shelf or on the floor, each more disturbing than the last. One evening, as I was sorting through the archives, I found another of those strange books, but this one was different. It didn't have a title, just a symbol etched into the cover, a twisted, almost serpentine design that made my stomach churn. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols, unfamiliar languages that seemed to writhe and shift before my eyes. As I stared at them, a voice, low and guttural, seemed to whisper in the back of my mind, growing louder until it drowned out all other thoughts. I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. The air in the room was thick with tension, the shadows pressing in on me from all sides. I had to get out. I raced to the front of the library, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the empty space. But when I reached the front desk, Mrs. Gilchrist was waiting for me, her expression colder than ever. "You've been snooping where you don't belong, Miss Andrews," she said, her voice low, dangerous. I don't understand," I stammered, backing away. She stepped forward, her gaze locking onto mine. "This library is not just a place for books. It is a sanctuary, a place where certain things are kept safe. But you've disturbed them." Behind her, I saw Mr. Wren emerge from the shadows, his eyes gleaming with something dark, something hungry. "You shouldn't have opened that book," Mrs. Gilchrist whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring in my ears. "Now they know you're here." I turned to run, but it was too late. The whispers had grown louder, filling my head, drowning out my thoughts. The last thing I saw was Mrs. Gilchrist's smile, wide and cold, as the shadows closed in around me. They found my body the next morning, slumped over the front desk, eyes wide and unseeing. No one would speak of what happened that night, and the library carried on, as it always had. Another assistant arrived a week later. A young man, fresh out of college, eager to start his new job. The silence between the shelves continued, waiting, watching,